Hello, this is Maria Williams with another card video. I've been a little obsessed with the Stamp Market products recently, so today I'm making 3 cards using products from their latest release. I started out with the intention of making just one card, so I have this set of products, which is the Bear Hugs stamp set and coordinating dies. I also have some of their white cardstock and also a Color Crush Patterns paper pack that has 12 sheets in it, which I think is a good size because sometimes the packs are so big, even if you love them, you just can't use the whole pack. And then I'm also going to be using some of the colors from the assorted Color Crush cardstock pack. And then I'm using the Cherry Kisses and the Blush inks. And I have my sidekick set up because these dies are pretty small, but I will be using my Big Shot a little bit later. So the first thing I'm going to do is cut out my pieces of paper that I'm going to be using, and I picked out this lattice background for the background of the card. There is a stamp called Crisscross Background that is the same pattern. I got the diamond tile background stamp because the crisscross background was not available, but like I said, in this case I'm just going to use the pattern paper. And then I've also picked out this white paper that has kind of this rainbow pattern at the bottom. I'm going to cover the whole front of my card with the pattern paper, so I'm just trimming it down to 4¼ inches by 5½. And then I'm also trimming the rainbow paper down to 1 inch smaller than the card front. So I'm trimming it down to 3¼ inches by 4½ inches. And I'm cutting the white part of the paper off so that I can keep the rainbow. Next, I'm going to take out the 2 stamps, the little critters from the stamp set, and mount them onto a block. I could have used my Misty for this, but I figured this was pretty simple stamping. The black areas on the one bear are pretty solid, so you could use a Misty, especially if you have a stamp pad like mine that wasn't really inky. You could use the Misty so that you could stamp multiple times, but I pulled out my stamps, put them on a stamping block, and stamped them multiple times, hoping that I would get really good coverage, and that still wasn't working. So I went ahead and took my chamois out, wiped the stamps really well, and then inked them with Versamark ink, stamped a few times, and that really helped the black ink stick to my stamps, and then my impressions were a whole lot better. I often stamp extra images so that if I mess something up or I decide to do extra cards, I already have the images stamped. So I did 2 sets of these little bears, and I'm just going to use 2 of them for the first card. I trimmed the piece of cardstock so that it would be narrow enough to fit through my sidekick, and then I just aligned the dies with the images and secured them down with a little bit of purple tape, and then I just run everything through my sidekick, and everything cut great. I've decided I'm not 100% loving this purple tape. When I use it with die cuts like this in my sidekick, and sometimes even in my Big Shot, I do okay. But I have noticed that especially if I'm die cutting delicate images and I'm using my precision plate, and I would imagine it's the same thing if you end up using a metal shim, it does end up sticking really hard to my paper, and then it rips my paper. So if I'm doing delicate things and I'm having to use a precision plate, I do tend to use just post-it tape. At this point, I wanted to make sure that I liked my layout, so I arranged all my bits and pieces and decided that to fill in a little bit of the space, I would use the Hearts stamp from the same stamp set. And then I thought the layout looked a little bit plain. So I decided to bring in a little bit of black. So I trimmed down the piece of piece of pattern paper down by 1/8 inch on both sides, so it ended up being 3¼ by 4�3/8. And then I trimmed a piece of black cardstock. This is actually Lawn Fawn black licorice cardstock, which is pretty thick cardstock, and I trimmed that down to the original dimensions of the pattern paper, which were 3¼ by 4½. And this gives me just a really thin border, a 1/16 of an inch border all the way around the pattern paper. I was going to attach all the paper and cardstock panels together, but I decided to only attach the rainbow piece of pattern paper to the black mat, and I used fast fuse for this, and I know it doesn't look like the regular color. I got this from Stampin' Up, so my refill is actually not Stampin' Up, but the outside of it is. So the outside is blue, the inside is red. So anyway, I matted those two together, and then I got ready to stamp. This time I decided to prep my stamp in a slightly different way, which was to use an eraser and rub it across the surface of the stamp. Then I took some bubblegum ink and tried the stamp out on a piece of scratch paper, and it looked good. So I went ahead and stamped it onto the pattern paper between the two bears. I prepped my sentiment stamp the same way that I did before with the eraser, and then I inked it up with my Memento Tuxedo black ink and stamped it onto scratch paper, and decided that I wanted to make sure my sentiment was in the right place. And this is a good thing to do sometimes if you're not 100% sure about the placement of things, is I just trimmed out the sentiment with scissors and then put it onto my card where I thought it would look good, and then use that as my guide for stamping. I was not loving the way the hearts looked on my card, so I decided to instead die cut the little hearts that come in the die set. So I pulled out my Color Crush assorted cardstock collection and pulled out some party pink and just run the die through my little sidekick. So a quick word about these cardstocks. They are considered 80 pound, but they are thinner than some others. They're not extremely thin. You can still die cut nicely. I wouldn't necessarily use them for card bases as they are. You'll see that later on I did use some of this cardstock as a base, but I put another piece of cardstock on the inside to write on, and so that reinforces it. But overall, I think it's a pretty good cardstock. It's just not as thick as some others, which makes it great for layering. I used my favorite current glue, which is Nouveau Deluxe Adhesive, to glue the hearts down, and placement was easy since I had already stamped them and they're pretty much the same size. So I just put the glue onto my paper and then put the heart down, and I did use my scissors to kind of help me move them around since they're so tiny. And then I used some foam squares to attach the two bears to the card front. But before I attached them, I actually thought to color the one bear that I added a little bit of color to. So I set the two bears aside and used the same Nouveau Deluxe adhesive to glue the pattern paper to the card front, and also the two other pieces, the cardstock on the paper, to the card front. So next I picked out two different Copic markers, E00 and E11, to color in the bear. And I did the part with the E00, and then instead of finishing my coloring, I decided that I wanted to add a couple more hearts to the bears. Instead of coloring them in, I was going to die cut them. So I die cut a couple more of the hearts out of that party pink cardstock and glued them onto both bears, and then proceeded to finish my coloring with the E11. I don't really recommend doing your coloring in this order. I would recommend finishing the coloring, then attaching the hearts, then attaching the bears to the card. But sometimes the mind just wanders and you do things a little out of order. The last thing I did for the card front was to take my Nouveau Aqua Shimmer pen and add a little bit of shimmer to all the hearts, the ones on the bears and the ones between the two bears. I've been making a little bit more of an effort lately to decorate the insides of my cards, which I used to do all the time years ago. And all I did was to take another one of the brown bears, die cut it, color it in, and then just glued it to the inside of my card. Instead of trying to find a Copic marker that matched my pink, I decided to just take the bubblegum pink, which I realize is not the same one that I used for the hearts on the outside of the card, but I pressed it onto my glass mat and then used a blender pen to pick up some of the ink and colored in the heart. This is a really handy way to add color to small areas of your cards. And this is card number 1, all finished. For my second card, I decided to bring in my favorite die of the moment, which is the Happy Hearts cover die. And I wanted to see how the Stamp Market inks and cardstock would blend with a blender brush. I think I've mentioned a couple times before probably that I got my brushes from Amazon and they're just makeup brushes. I would like to get some of the newer ones that have white bristles so that you can see how much ink you have on there, but for now these work great. So I just started out with a scrap of the Stamp Market white cardstock, and I'm using a piece of a nonstick heat-resistant craft mat. It was pretty large. I can't remember the name of it. I've had it for so many years. But anyway, I cut it down into smaller pieces. So I'm just using one of those pieces and just blending the bubblegum ink toward the bottom. I'm going to create kind of an ombre effect. And I'm noticing right off the bat that obviously these inks do not blend like Distress Oxide inks, but I am getting pretty good coverage, and I'm just going to keep on going and see how it turns out. And again, I want to clarify that you're not going to get any results that are similar to Distress Oxides with one of these dye-based inks. The beauty of these inks is that they dry quickly when you stamp, so they're not going to stay wet like the Distress Oxide ink. I'm trying to create an ombre effect, so now I'm taking the blush ink, and I did get a clean brush, and I'm going to start blending right above the bubblegum inking that I've already done. I want the top of the panel to stay white, so I want an ombre effect that fades all the way to white. And then once I have an area that's fairly well inked, I'm going back into the bubblegum colored area, and I just kind of go back and forth a little bit just to get a pretty good blend. And I'm not worried about getting a perfect blend, because once I put my die cut on top, it's going to disguise a lot of that, and I'm also going to be putting an additional panel on top of this, so I'm not worried about getting a perfect blend. Once I'm happy with my panel, I'm just taking a Lawn Fawn inside out stitch rectangle, I think it's called. I'll have the proper name and the link on my blog post, but I'm using my precision plate to cut this out. I've had some issues with these dies cutting through with a with my regular plastic cutting pads, so I'm using the precision plate, and I don't want my panel to get torn, so I'm using post-it tape. Next, I'm going to get to work on my die cut, and I'm applying some scrapbook.com adhesive sheet to the back of a piece of white Stamp Market cardstock. And since this is pretty detailed, I really didn't want to deal with putting little bits of glue all over the place. So I'm finding that I really like this adhesive sheet. I've tried the Sizzix ones, and I wasn't really happy with those. I felt like every time my finger touched the adhesive would just come right off onto my finger. And I don't find that that happens with this scrapbook.com adhesive sheet. Once I have the adhesive sheet on the back of my cardstock, I'm just placing my die on top of it and running it through my Big Shot, again with my precision base plate. And I did run it through and then back to make sure that everything cut. And I wasn't sure that it was going to cut through the adhesive backing and everything, but it did. There were some areas that stuck, and really I didn't need to pull out all these little pieces because I'm just going to peel it off of the release paper, but I kind of wanted to see how well it cut. So I would run it, if you wanted to cut all the way through the adhesive backer, then I would probably run it through 3 or 4 times. Once I had pulled out all the hearts, I removed the release paper from the back and placed my die cut onto my card front panel. And I did kind of stick it down, and then I felt like it wasn't quite right. So I was able to peel it up very, very carefully and then put it back down. So you do have a little bit of wiggle room with this adhesive. And then when I was happy with where it was, I flipped it over and ran a bone folder over the back of this panel just to make sure that everything was really glued down, especially since I had already pulled it up once. I just want to make sure that everything was really well stuck down. I'm going to use one of the brown bears again, and I wanted to use a stitched square, but I didn't have a die that was the right size, so I decided to take one of the smaller dies from the same Lawn Fawn set that I used to cut the front panel with, and I've already cut the rectangle out once, and then I'm going to rotate it 90 degrees and kind of line it up to make sure that what I'm going to end up with is a square and that it's kind of even on all sides. And then I'm going to use some of the purple tape on the back. I'm sorry, I'm using it on the front, but I'm making sure that it does not touch the center, in other words, the square that I'm going to use, and then I'm going to run it through my Big Shot again. And as you can see, I get a perfectly cut stitched square. I really didn't want to mess up my square, my stitch square that I just die cut, so I'm using my Misty to stamp my little sentiment that says hugs and kisses. So I'm just lining it up with the square, picking it up with the lid, inking it up with Cherry Kisses ink, and stamping it a couple of times. I want my stitch square to have a mat of red around it, so I'm just gluing it into the corner of a scrap, and then I'm going to use my small trimmer to trim around it. Then I'm just going to take my little bear and glue it into the square, and that's done. I'm going to set it aside. And to add a little bit more interest to the front of the card, I am going to use the same Happy Hearts cover die to cut out 3 hearts from Cherry Kisses cardstock. And I'm going to insert them into the white die cut that is on the front of the card. Before I do that, I'm going to go ahead and attach the ink blended panel onto a piece of Cherry Kisses cardstock that is cut to the same size as my card front, so 4 1/4 by 5 1/2. And then I'm going to attach that to a 110-pound Nina Solar White. Did I say 110 pound? 110 pound Nina Solar White card base that I have already prepared. To insert the hearts into the die cut, I found it easier, rather than putting the glue onto the hearts and then inserting them, to put the glue into the open spaces and then just place the hearts there. And then to attach my square with the bear, I just use some foam tape and place that right above the red hearts. Last but not least, I added a little bit of Nuvo Aqua Shimmer pen to the red hearts, and that was it for the card. I really like the way this card turned out. It's one of those cards that makes me happy every time I look at it. I realized my video was getting pretty long, so I kind of have to rush through my last card a little bit, but you've seen most of the techniques that I've been using. So for the last card, I decided to make a card that was sized perfectly to the Happy Hearts cover die. That's the beauty of making your own cards. So I cut it out of 2 different colors. I cut it out of Tropic Teal and of the white cardstock after applying adhesive sheet to the back, just like I did for the second card. I then took the teal die cut and carefully layered it on top of the white one so that I could see a little bit of the white offset from the teal hearts. And I wish that I could have gotten a little bit more of the white, but once I had pressed this down, I'd pressed it down so much that I really couldn't pick it up, and everything is so delicate here that I just didn't want to risk it. So I left it as it is. I'm going to cut the card base out of teal cardstock, so here I have my sheet, and instead of taking measurements, I just peeled off the backing from the white die cut and I stuck it down onto the corner there, and then I took all of this to my paper trimmer and carefully trimmed along the top of the hearts, so that gives me the height of the card. And then I put it on my mini scoreboard, and I took one of my plates from my Big Shot just so that I could figure out exactly which line on my scoreboard I was supposed to use, and I just scored down the side of the die cut. Not along the side of the die cut because it would have been crooked, but straight down so that I wouldn't be interfering with any of the hearts. Then I took the card base back to my paper trimmer and trimmed off the excess. I also cut a piece of white cardstock that was a little bit smaller, a 1/4 inch smaller than the card base, to have an area, a white area to write on, and also to reinforce the back of the card. For the focal point of my card, I cut out a piece of 2 1/4 by 2 3/4 white cardstock, and I was going to stamp this in my MISTI, but then I decided to just go for it. And to stabilize my little piece of cardstock, I was going to put some repositionable adhesive onto the back, but then I decided to take out my MISTI pad. I have some Sizzix adhesive sheets. These are removable. I can't remember where I got the tip to cover my MISTI pad with it, but instead of using magnets, you can just put your cardstock on there and it holds it down perfectly. I absolutely love these sheets. I thought I had actually shown them in the video, but I don't see that footage. So anyway, my piece is nicely anchored down, so I just used some Tropic Teal ink and stamped the sending you lots of hugs stamp all around, and then I could have just stamped the black and white bear directly onto the panel, but I had already die cut one, so I just glued that and then stamped in black memento ink the thanks so much sentiment, and then matted all of this onto a piece of white cardstock that is barely larger than 2 1/4 by 2 3/4, and glued all those two pieces down onto my card front. So here are my 3 finished cards, or are they? Do you see the pink card with the bear that's not totally colored in? Yep. I went and got my R29, colored in the heart, and finished coloring the bear. I hope you enjoyed the video and or learned a little something, and if you did, please give it a thumbs up. See you next time. For links to the products I used and still shots, please visit my blog at mariascardsandmore.com. Thank you so much for watching and have a great day.